The fluorescent lights of the small neighborhood cafe buzzed softly overhead, casting a pale glow across the worn linoleum floor. It was a Tuesday evening in São Paulo, the kind of evening where the summer heat had finally broken into something almost bearable, and people were starting to emerge from their air-conditioned hiding places. The cafe wasn't fancy, just a corner spot with mismatched chairs and tables that had seen better decades. But it was the kind of place where nobody bothered you, where you could sit for hours with a single cup of coffee and watch the world pass by through streaked windows. Carolina sat at a table near the back, her fingers wrapped around a mug that had gone cold 20 minutes ago. She was 34 today, 34 years old, and she was spending her birthday alone in a cafe that smelled like burnt coffee and old grease, pretending to be interested in her phone while her chest felt like it might cave in from the weight of loneliness. She'd told herself it would be fine. She'd told herself that birthdays didn't matter, that they were just another day, that she had more important things to worry about, like how she was going to make rent next month, or whether her daughter's school shoes would last another few weeks, or if she could pick up an extra shift at the hospital where she worked as a nursing assistant. But sitting here now, watching couples share pastries and groups of friends laugh over shared plates, she felt the lie crack open inside her chest. It wasn't fine. Nothing about this was fine. She'd worked a double shift yesterday, covering for someone else because she needed the money, and she'd gotten home so late that her daughter Julia was already asleep. This morning, she'd woken up hoping, God, she'd been hoping so hard, that maybe Julia would remember, that maybe her 7-year-old would wake up excited, would have drawn a card at school, would sing happy birthday in that off-key way that made Carolina's heart feel too big for her body. But Julia had been tired, cranky from staying up too late, and Carolina had been rushing to get her ready for school before her own shift started. There had been no time for birthday wishes, no moment of celebration, just the usual chaos of breakfast and backpacks and, Mom, I can't find my homework and, we're going to be late. And then Julia was gone, picked up by Carolina's neighbor who dropped her at school on the way to work, and Carolina was alone again, staring at another day that looked exactly like all the others. She'd tried calling her mother earlier. Her phone had rung 6 times before going to voicemail, and Carolina had hung up without leaving a message because what was the point? Her mother had never been good with dates, never been good at remembering the small things that mattered. Carolina had learned a long time ago not to expect much. Her ex-husband, well, he was somewhere in Rio, or maybe Minas Gerais. She'd stopped keeping track, living whatever life he'd decided was more important than the one he'd made with her. He hadn't called in 8 months, not for Julia's last birthday, not for Christmas, not for anything. The cafe door chimed as someone entered, and Carolina glanced up out of habit before looking back down at her phone. She'd been scrolling through social media for the past half hour, watching other people's perfectly curated lives, their birthday posts filled with flowers and cakes and friends gathered around restaurant tables. She knew it was masochistic, knew she should put the phone away, but she couldn't seem to stop. It was like picking at a scab, that compulsive need to make yourself hurt just a little bit more. Her coffee had a film on top now, completely undrinkable, but she didn't want to order another one because money was tight, and she'd already spent more than she should have just sitting here. The waitress, a tired-looking woman in her 50s with dyed red hair, had stopped checking on her 20 minutes ago, which was fine. Carolina didn't want attention. She just wanted to sit here in this anonymous space and let the birthday pass without having to think about how different her life had turned out from what she'd imagined when she was younger. She heard a child's voice then, bright and insistent, cutting through the low murmur of cafe conversation. "Papai, wait, look at that lady. She looks sad." Carolina's shoulders tensed. She kept her eyes on her phone, hoping whoever it was would move on, would leave her alone in her carefully constructed bubble of invisible grief. But she could feel eyes on her now, could sense someone's attention like a physical touch. "Miguel, no, we shouldn't bother her," a man's voice said, soft and uncertain, speaking in that careful tone parents use when they're trying to redirect their children without causing a scene. "But Papai, she's alone. And it's someone's birthday, we have the cake. Carolina risked a glance up. A little boy, maybe 5 or 6 years old, was standing a few feet away from her table, holding his father's hand and staring at her with those enormous, earnest eyes that children have before life teaches them to look away from other people's pain. He had dark, curly hair that stuck up in several directions and was wearing a striped shirt that had a stain on the collar. Next to him, his father looked exhausted in a way Carolina recognized instantly. The kind of exhaustion that went bone deep, that came from carrying weight no one else could see. The man was probably in his late 30s, with the sort of face that might have been handsome if it wasn't drawn so tight with tension. His shirt was wrinkled, his hair needed a cut, and there were shadows under his eyes that spoke of too many sleepless nights. He was holding a small bakery box in his free hand, the white cardboard kind with a window on top, and through it Carolina could see what looked like a small cake with pink frosting. "I'm so sorry," the man said, his voice strained with embarrassment. "My son, we'll leave you alone. I'm sorry to disturb you." But the boy, Miguel, wasn't moving. He was looking at Carolina with an intensity that made her chest tighten, like he could see straight through her careful facade to the raw hurt underneath. "Are you having a birthday?" he asked, his voice small but certain. Carolina's throat closed up. She couldn't speak for a moment, couldn't figure out how to form words around the sudden swell of emotion. She should lie. She should tell him no, should smile politely, and send them away so she could go back to her misery in peace. But something in the boy's face stopped her. Maybe it was the way he was looking at her, like her answer actually mattered, like she mattered. "Yes," she heard herself say, her voice coming out rougher than she intended. "It's my birthday." Miguel's face lit up like she'd just told him the best news in the world. He turned to his father with an urgency that made the man's expression crack into something that looked almost like pain. "Papai, see, we have to share the cake. We have to. Amin would want us to." The man, the father, closed his eyes for just a second, and Carolina saw his jaw work like he was trying to swallow something sharp. When he opened his eyes again, they were bright with unshed tears, but he was smiling, a broken sort of smile that made Carolina's heart twist in her chest. "You're right, meu filho," he said quietly. "She would want us to." He looked at Carolina then, really looked at her, and she saw her own loneliness reflected back in his eyes. "I'm Rafael," he said. "Rafael Santos. And this is Miguel. He paused, seeming to gather himself. "We'd like to share this cake with you if that's okay. If you don't mind the company." Carolina should say no. She should politely decline, should maintain her dignity, should not accept pity from strangers in a cafe. But looking at Rafael's exhausted face and Miguel's hopeful eyes, and that small cake in its bakery box, she found she couldn't. Because maybe she was tired of being alone. Maybe she was tired of pretending she was fine. Maybe, just for a moment, she could let herself accept something good, even if it came from the most unexpected place. "Okay," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "I'd like that." Miguel didn't wait for his father's permission. He pulled away from Rafael's hand and climbed up into the chair across from Carolina, his small body vibrating with excitement. Rafael hesitated for just a moment before sitting down next to his son, placing the cake box carefully on the table between them. The waitress appeared as if summoned, her tired expression softening slightly when she saw Miguel. "Tres pratos y garfos, por favor," Rafael said, "and maybe some napkins." The waitress nodded and disappeared again. An awkward silence settled over the table, the kind that happens when strangers suddenly find themselves sharing space without quite knowing how they got there. Carolina could feel her heart beating too fast in her chest, could feel the weight of Rafael's eyes on her, even though he was looking down at the table. Miguel, however, seemed completely comfortable with the situation, swinging his legs under his chair and humming a little tune to himself. "This is strange," Carolina said finally, because someone had to acknowledge it. "This whole situation is, you don't know me. I don't know you." Rafael looked up at her then, and she saw something in his expression that made her breath catch. Understanding. Recognition. The look of someone who had been where she was, who knew what it felt like to sit alone and try to hold yourself together while the world kept spinning. "My wife died 10 months ago," he said quietly, his voice steady but hollow. "Breast cancer. She fought for 2 years and then—" He paused, glanced at Miguel, who had stopped humming, and was now tracing patterns on the table with his finger. 10 months. And every day since then has felt like trying to walk underwater. Like everything is harder than it should be and no one else can see it. Carolina's breath left her in a rush. "I'm sorry," she whispered. "I'm so sorry." Raphael shook his head. "No, I didn't say it for sympathy. I said it because I can see it. In you. That look of someone who's trying so hard to keep it together that you're afraid if you stop trying even for a second, you'll fall apart completely." The waitress returned with plates and forks and a small stack of napkins. Raphael opened the cake box, revealing a simple round cake with pink frosting and delicate sugar flowers on top. Written across it in neat script were the words, "Para você com amor," for you with love. "We were supposed to take this to the cemetery," Raphael said, his voice soft. "It's what we do on Tuesdays. Mariana, my wife, she loved Tuesdays. I never understood why, but she always said they were underrated. So every Tuesday, Miguel and I, we get a little cake or some flowers or something she loved, and we go to where she's buried. We sit there and we talk to her and we—" His voice cracked and he cleared his throat. "We try to remember what it felt like when she was still here." Miguel had gone very still, his eyes fixed on the cake. Carolina watched him, saw the way his small shoulders had hunched slightly, the way his bottom lip had started to tremble. Without thinking, she reached across the table and covered his small hand with hers. "But Mama isn't at the cemetery," Miguel said suddenly, his voice tight. "Popeye says she's in heaven, but I don't understand heaven. I just know she's not here." Raphael closed his eyes again, his hand moving to cup the back of his son's head in a gesture that spoke of infinite tenderness and infinite exhaustion. "No, she's not here, meu amor, but we still remember her. We still honor her. She would want us to share the cake," Miguel insisted, his voice stronger now, like he was certain of this one truth in a world that had become uncertain. "She always said birthdays were important, that everyone deserves to feel special on their birthday. She would want us to share." Carolina felt tears burning behind her eyes. She blinked them back, tried to swallow past the lump in her throat. That's very kind of you both, but you don't have to." "Please," Raphael said, and there was something in his voice that stopped her protest. "Please let us do this. I think—" He paused, seemed to search for the right words. "I think maybe we all need this, whatever this is." So Carolina nodded, and Raphael cut the cake into 3 pieces with the plastic knife the bakery had included. The slices weren't even. His hands were shaking slightly, and he had to stop twice to steady himself. But Miguel didn't seem to care. He picked up his fork and looked at Carolina expectantly, like he was waiting for permission. "Make a wish first," he said seriously. "You always have to make a wish." Carolina looked at the piece of cake on her plate, at the pink frosting and the delicate sugar flowers, at this small gesture of kindness from 2 strangers who were carrying their own unbearable weight. What did she wish for? What could she possibly wish for that would make any difference? She closed her eyes and thought about Julia, about making rent, about getting through another day. She thought about Raphael's tired eyes and Miguel's trembling lip, and that cemetery they visited every Tuesday. She thought about loneliness and grief, and the strange, terrible ways life could break you open without warning. She wished for strength. For all of them. For the strength to keep going even when everything hurt, even when the world felt too heavy, even when you were sitting alone in a cafe on your birthday wondering how you'd ended up here. When she opened her eyes, Miguel was smiling at her. "Did you make a good wish?" "I did," Carolina said, and she was surprised to find she meant it. They ate in silence for a while, the sweetness of the cake almost overwhelming after the bitterness of Carolina's cold coffee. The cafe had grown busier around them, the dinner crowd starting to trickle in. But their little table felt separate somehow, like they existed in a pocket of space where the normal rules didn't quite apply. "I'm a single mother," Carolina said suddenly, surprising herself. She never talked about her life, never shared her struggles with anyone. But something about this moment, about these two strangers who had chosen to sit with her, made her want to be honest. "My husband left when my daughter was 3. Just decided he didn't want to be a father anymore, didn't want to be married anymore. Said he felt trapped, that this wasn't the life he'd imagined. So he left." Raphael's fork stopped halfway to his mouth. He set it down carefully, his full attention on her now. "How old is your daughter?" 7. "Julia. She's 7 years old and she's smart and funny and she deserves so much better than what I can give her. I work as a nursing assistant. I pick up extra shifts whenever I can, but it's never enough. The rent keeps going up, her school needs new uniforms, she needs books and supplies and—" Carolina stopped, realizing she was rambling, that she was spilling out her fears to complete strangers. "I'm sorry. I don't know why I'm telling you this. Because sometimes it's easier to talk to strangers," Raphael said quietly. "Because we don't know you, so you don't have to worry about disappointing us or burdening us. Because sometimes you just need someone to hear you." Miguel had been quiet, working on his cake with single-minded focus. But now he looked up at Carolina with those serious two-old eyes. "Is your daughter going to remember your birthday later? Is someone going to tell her?" The question hit Carolina like a physical blow. She opened her mouth to answer, to make some excuse, but Raphael must have seen something in her face because he reached out and put a hand on his son's shoulder. "Miguel," he said gently. But Miguel wasn't letting it go. "When it was Popeye's birthday last month, I forgot. I was sad about Mama and I didn't remember. And then it was nighttime and Popeye was crying in the bathroom and I heard him and I felt so bad. But then I made him a card the next day and I said sorry and he said it was okay. So maybe your daughter will remember later and she'll make you a card too." Carolina couldn't stop the tears now. They spilled down her cheeks before she could catch them, hot and fast and carrying with them all the grief she'd been trying to hold back. She pressed her napkin to her face, embarrassed by this display of emotion in front of strangers, in front of a child who had already seen too much loss. "I'm sorry," she gasped. "I'm so sorry. I don't usually—" "Don't apologize," Raphael said, and his voice was rough with his own emotion. "Please don't apologize for being human." He stood up, walked around the table, and before Carolina could process what was happening, he had wrapped his arms around her shoulders in a hug that was awkward and too tight, and exactly what she needed. She could smell laundry detergent and something else, something warm and safe, and she let herself lean into it for just a moment, let herself accept this comfort from a stranger who understood what it meant to fall apart. When Raphael pulled back, his own eyes were wet. He returned to his seat, wiping at his face with the back of his hand, and Miguel was watching them both with an expression that was far too solemn for a child his age. "Popeye cries a lot," Miguel said matter-of-factly. "Tia Sofia says it's okay to cry. She says it's because we have big feelings and sometimes feelings are too big to keep inside." "Tia Sofia is very wise," Carolina said, her voice still shaky. "Who is she?" "My sister," Raphael explained. "She lives in Campinas, about an hour away. She comes to visit when she can, helps with Miguel. She's been—" He paused, seemed to gather himself. "She's been my lifeline. I don't know how I would have survived these months without her." Carolina nodded, understanding that feeling of desperate gratitude for any help, any support. "My neighbor, Dona Beatriz, she picks up Julia from school sometimes when I'm working. She doesn't have to, but she does it anyway. I don't know what I'd do without her." "It's strange," Raphael said slowly, "how grief and hardship can show you who really matters, how it strips away all the superficial relationships and leaves you with just the people who actually show up." They talked then, really talked, in a way Carolina hadn't talked to another adult in months. Raphael told her about Mariana, about how they'd met in college, about how she'd been a teacher and loved working with children. He told her about the diagnosis, about the treatments that had stolen her energy and her hair, but never quite managed to steal her hope. He told her about the last days when she'd been so weak but had still insisted on reading to Miguel every night, her voice barely above a whisper as she turned the pages of his favorite books. "She made me promise," Raphael said, his voice breaking. "Made me promise that I'd keep living, that I'd make sure Miguel remembered how to be happy, that I wouldn't let grief turn us into ghosts." He laughed, but it was a hollow sound. "Some days I don't know how to keep that promise. Some days I feel like I'm failing her every moment. I'm just going through the motions." Carolina told him about the early years with her ex-husband, about how she'd been so in love, so certain they were building something beautiful together. She told him about the slow disintegration of that certainty, about the fights and the silences and the way he'd started staying out later and later. She told him about the day he'd sat her down and said he was leaving, that he'd met someone else, someone who didn't have stretch marks and exhaustion written into her bones, someone who made him feel young again. "The worst part," Carolina said, her voice barely audible, "was that I wasn't even surprised. I'd seen it coming for so long that when it finally happened, I just felt relieved. Like at least now I could stop waiting for the other shoe to drop." She paused, pushing frosting around her plate with her fork. But then the reality set in. The bills, the loneliness, trying to explain to Julia why her father didn't come home anymore. And I realized that knowing something is coming doesn't make it any easier when it actually happens. Miguel had finished his cake and was now drawing on a napkin with a pen he'd found in his father's pocket. Every so often he'd glance up at them, his small face serious, like he was absorbing everything they were saying, even if he didn't fully understand it. The cafe had grown louder as the evening wore on, filled now with the clatter of dishes and the hum of conversation. But their table remained a quiet island, a space where three people who had been alone were suddenly, unexpectedly, together. "Do you know what the hardest part is?" Raphael asked suddenly. "It's the mundane stuff. Everyone expects you to fall apart at the big moments, the funeral, the first holidays, the anniversary of her death. And you do, you absolutely do. But it's the regular Tuesday nights that really get you. It's making dinner and realizing you've accidentally made enough for three people. It's Miguel asking a question about homework, and you start to call for Mariana before you remember. It's seeing her toothbrush still in the holder and not being able to throw it away." Carolina nodded, understanding completely. It's Julia asking if Papai is coming to her school play and having to say no again. It's seeing other families at the park, the dad pushing the swing while the mom watches and smiles, and feeling like you're somehow not enough by yourself. It's birthday mornings when no one remembers because there's no one there to remember. They sat in silence for a moment, the weight of shared understanding settling over them like a blanket. It wasn't comfortable exactly, but it was real. It was honest. It was two people acknowledging that life could be brutally hard, and that sometimes just surviving was an achievement worth celebrating. "I need to tell you something," Raphael said finally, his voice hesitant. "About the cake. About why Miguel was so insistent on sharing it." Carolina waited, watching his face as he seemed to struggle with whatever he wanted to say. 2 weeks before Mariana died, when she could barely speak anymore, she was lying in her hospital bed and Miguel had fallen asleep in the chair next to her. It was just the two of us, and she grabbed my hand and made me lean in close so she could whisper to me. Raphael's voice was thick now, the words coming slowly. She said, "Promise me something. Promise me that you'll find ways to spread love even when you're hurting, especially when you're hurting. Because that's when the world needs it most." Tears were sliding down Raphael's cheeks now, but he didn't try to hide them. I didn't understand what she meant at first. I was so angry at God, at the universe, at everything. How was I supposed to spread love when I felt like I was drowning? But then, a few weeks ago, Miguel and I were at the bakery getting our Tuesday cake, and there was this elderly woman in front of us who was counting out coins, trying to buy a small bread roll, and she didn't have enough money. She was so embarrassed, apologizing to the cashier, and I paid for it. I paid for her bread and threw in a few extra things, and the look on her face, He stopped, took a breath. Miguel said, "Mama would have liked that." And I realized that's what she meant, that even in grief, especially in grief, we have to choose to be kind. Miguel looked up from his drawing then, his eyes bright. "So when I saw you looking sad, I knew we had to share the cake. Because Mama would want us to. Because being sad alone is worse than being sad with other people." Carolina felt something crack open inside her chest, something that had been frozen and numb for so long. This child, this beautiful, wise child who had lost his mother, who was probably drowning in his own grief, had seen her pain and wanted to help. And his father, this exhausted man who was barely holding himself together, had honored that instinct instead of shutting it down. "Thank you," she whispered. "Thank you both. This is the kindest thing anyone has done for me in a very long time." "What time does your daughter get home from school?" Rafael asked, glancing at his watch. Carolina checked her phone. "She's with Dona Beatriz until 7. I usually pick her up after my shift, but today I just couldn't go straight there. I needed a moment to—" She trailed off, not sure how to explain the desperate need she'd felt to sit alone with her disappointment before having to put on a brave face for Julia. Rafael nodded like he understood completely. "Do you have plans? For tonight, I mean?" "No," Carolina admitted. "I was going to pick her up, go home, make some pasta, and pretend it was just another day." "What if—" Rafael paused, seemed to reconsider, then forged ahead anyway. "What if you didn't do that? What if you let tonight be special, even if it didn't start that way?" Carolina frowned, not understanding. "What do you mean?" "There's a pizzeria 2 blocks from here," Rafael said. "Nothing fancy, but they have good pizza, and they let kids make their own small ones. Miguel loves it. What if you called your neighbor and asked her to bring Julia here? We could all have dinner together. You and your daughter, me and Miguel. Just a birthday dinner, with people who understand what it means to need company." Carolina stared at him, not quite believing what she was hearing. You don't have to do that. You've already done so much, and I don't want to impose." "You're not imposing," Rafael said firmly. "And maybe I need this too. Maybe Miguel needs this. We've spent 10 months isolating ourselves, being alone with our grief. Maybe it's time to start. Not moving on, that's not the right word. But maybe it's time to start letting other people in. To start building something new, even if it looks nothing like what we had before." Miguel was nodding enthusiastically. "Please say yes. I want to meet Julia. Does she like pizza? I hope she likes pizza. I'm going to put extra cheese on mine." Carolina looked at them, at Rafael's hopeful, terrified expression, at Miguel's excitement, at this unexpected lifeline being offered to her on a day when she'd felt so completely alone. Every instinct told her to say no, to protect herself, to not let herself need anything from anyone. But she was so tired of being strong, so tired of doing everything alone. "Okay," she heard herself say. "Okay, yes, let me call Dona Beatriz." The relief on Rafael's face was almost painful to see. "Really?" "Really," Carolina said, pulling out her phone with shaking hands. "But I'm paying for my own pizza. I have my pride." "Absolutely not," Rafael said with mock sternness. "It's your birthday. The birthday girl never pays." "Then we're splitting it," Carolina insisted. "Or I'm not coming." Rafael held up his hands in surrender. "Fine, we split it, but I'm buying dessert." Carolina called Dona Beatriz, who answered on the second ring with her usual warm greeting. "Carolina, querida, is everything okay? Do you need me to keep Julia longer?" "Actually," Carolina said, her voice unsteady, "I was wondering if you could bring her to the pizzeria on Rua das Flores, the one with the red awning. I know it's last minute, and if you can't, I'll have her there in 20 minutes." Dona Beatriz interrupted, and Carolina could hear the smile in her voice. Are you having a birthday celebration after all?" "Something like that," Carolina said, glancing at Rafael and Miguel. "Something unexpected." "Good," Dona Beatriz said firmly. "You deserve unexpected good things. I'll make sure she's dressed nicely." When Carolina hung up, Miguel was practically vibrating with excitement. Is she coming? Is Julia coming? She's coming, Carolina confirmed, and the smile that broke across Miguel's face was like sunshine after a storm. They packed up the remaining cake. Miguel insisted on carrying it very carefully, and walked the 2 blocks to the pizzeria together. The evening air was warm and thick with the smell of street food and car exhaust, the familiar chaos of São Paulo at dinner time swirling around them. Rafael walked between Carolina and Miguel, and every so often his hand would brush against hers, accidental touches that sent little sparks of awareness through her. The pizzeria was brightly lit and noisy, filled with families and couples and groups of friends. It was the kind of place that didn't take reservations, where you grabbed whatever table opened up and didn't complain about the wobbly chairs. Rafael managed to snag a booth near the back just as another family was leaving, and they slid in. Miguel on one side bouncing with excitement, Carolina next to him, and Rafael across from them. A teenage waiter brought them menus and water, barely glancing at them before disappearing again. Carolina looked around at the other families, at parents helping children choose toppings and couples sharing bottles of wine, and felt something strange stirring in her chest. Not quite happiness, it was too soon for that, too fragile, but maybe hope. Maybe the possibility that tonight wouldn't end the way it had started. "Are you nervous?" Rafael asked quietly, and she realized he was watching her with those perceptive eyes. "A little," she admitted. "Julia doesn't. She's not used to me having friends, and I don't want her to think—" She paused, not sure what she didn't want Julia to think. That this meant something? That Rafael was replacing her father? That happiness was possible even in the middle of hard times? "I understand," Rafael said. "Miguel either. After Mariana died, people stopped inviting us places. I think they didn't know what to say, how to act around us. So we've been alone a lot. This is good. For both of them." Miguel was coloring on the paper placemat with crayons the restaurant provided, drawing what looked like a very enthusiastic pizza. "I'm going to show Julia how to make the perfect pizza," he announced. "You have to put the cheese on first, then the toppings, then more cheese. That's the secret." "That's definitely the secret," Rafael agreed, his lips twitching with amusement. They didn't have to wait long. Carolina saw them first, Dona Beatriz pushing through the door with Julia in tow, her daughter's dark hair freshly brushed and wearing the good dress Carolina saved for special occasions. Julia's eyes were wide, taking in the unfamiliar restaurant, and then she spotted Carolina and her whole face transformed with confusion and cautious excitement. "Mai?" Julia called, pulling away from Dona Beatriz and weaving through tables toward them. "What are you doing here? Dona Beatriz said we were having pizza, but she didn't say you'd be here," and she stopped short when she saw Rafael and Miguel, her excitement dimming into uncertainty. Carolina slid out of the booth and dropped to her knees, pulling Julia into a tight hug. "Happy birthday to me," she whispered into her daughter's hair. "I'm having a birthday celebration after all." Julia pulled back, her eyes confused. "But this morning you said birthdays weren't important." "I was wrong," Carolina said, her throat tight. "Birthdays are important. You're important. And I'm sorry I said otherwise." Dona Beatriz had caught up to them, slightly out of breath. She took one look at the scene, at Carolina kneeling with her daughter, at Rafael and Miguel watching from the booth, and her expression softened with understanding. "I'll leave you to it then," she said quietly, squeezing Carolina's shoulder. "Enjoy your evening, querida. You've earned it." After Dona Beatriz left, Carolina stood up, keeping one hand on Julia's shoulder. "Julia, this is Rafael and his son Miguel. They helped me celebrate my birthday today, and they invited us to have pizza with them. Is that okay with you?" Julia looked between the strangers, her natural shyness making her press closer to her mother. But Miguel, bless him, wasn't shy at all. He scrambled out of the booth and stood in front of Julia with his hand extended like a tiny businessman. "Hi," he said seriously. "I'm Miguel Santos. I'm 6 years old and I like dinosaurs and building things and pizza. Do you like pizza?" The formality of it surprised a giggle out of Julia. She took his hand and shook it carefully. "I'm Julia. I'm 7 and I like drawing and reading, and yes, I like pizza. Good, Miguel said with satisfaction. Because we're going to make our own pizzas, and I'm going to show you the secret to the perfect pizza. It involves extra cheese. Just like that, the ice was broken. Julia slid into the booth next to Miguel, and they immediately began an intense discussion about pizza toppings, with Miguel making a very impassioned argument for pepperoni, while Julia insisted that vegetables were important for nutrition. Carolina caught Raphael's eye across the table, and they shared a smile that was equal parts relief and amazement. The evening unfolded like something out of a dream. They ordered their pizzas, Miguel and Julia making their own small ones with the patient help of the waiter. And while they waited for the food, the children chattered away like they'd known each other for years. Julia told Miguel about her school and her favorite teacher, Professora Ana, who let them bring stuffed animals to class on Fridays. Miguel told Julia about his building blocks and the enormous tower he was making, which was almost as tall as his papai. Carolina and Raphael talked too, but in a different way. Quieter, more careful, like they were feeling out the edges of this new connection. Raphael told her about his job as a civil engineer, how he'd been able to work from home more since Mariana got sick, how his boss had been understanding about his need for flexible hours. Carolina told him about the hospital, about the patients she cared for, about how she'd originally wanted to be a nurse but had to drop out of nursing school when she got pregnant with Julia. Maybe you could go back, Raphael said. Finish your degree. Carolina laughed, but it wasn't a bitter sound. Just realistic. With what time? With what money? I'm barely keeping my head above water as it is. I know, Raphael said, but maybe sometimes we have to believe things can change. Maybe that's what hope is. Not pretending everything is fine, but believing that someday it might be. Their pizzas arrived, and they ate with the enthusiasm of people who'd been too sad to enjoy food for too long. Julia and Miguel wore more cheese than they consumed, their faces sticky and happy. Carolina watched her daughter laugh at something Miguel said, watched her eyes light up with genuine joy, and felt her chest constrict with gratitude and grief and something else she couldn't quite name. Raphael was watching her, she realized, not in a creepy way, but with understanding. Like he could see what she was feeling because he was feeling it too. That bittersweet ache of seeing your child be happy when you'd almost forgotten what their happiness looked like. When they finished eating and the table had been cleared except for a mess of napkins and crumbs, Miguel suddenly gasped and grabbed the bakery box they'd brought with them. We forgot. We have cake. He opened the box carefully, revealing the slightly squashed but still beautiful pink cake. The waiter, seeing what was happening, disappeared and returned a moment later with a single candle stuck in a breadstick. It's not perfect, the waiter said with a shrug, but it's something. Raphael took the candle and placed it carefully in the center of the cake, then pulled out a lighter and lit it. The small flame flickered in the dim light of the restaurant, and Carolina felt tears pricking her eyes again as Miguel and Julia began to sing, their voices high and slightly off-key. Raphael joined in, his deep voice steadying theirs, and then other diners started to notice, started to add their voices to the chorus until half the restaurant was singing happy birthday to a woman they didn't know. When the song ended, everyone applauded, and Carolina sat there with tears streaming down her face while Julia looked at her with concern. Why are you crying? Because I'm happy, Carolina said, and she realized with shock that it was true. In this moment, sitting in a loud pizzeria with a daughter who loved her, and two strangers who had become something more than strangers, she was genuinely happy. Make a wish, meu amor. But it's your birthday, Julia protested. You make the wish. Carolina looked at the candle, at the three expectant faces watching her, at this small miracle of a celebration that had come from nowhere. She'd already made a wish earlier in the cafe. This time she wished for something different. She wished for the courage to keep saying yes, to keep opening herself up to possibility even when it scared her, to believe that good things could happen even to people who'd been broken. She blew out the candle, and everyone cheered. They shared the cake, 4 forks and 1 plate because that's all they needed, and talked until the restaurant started to empty out around them. Julia fell asleep against Carolina's shoulder, exhausted from excitement and sugar, and Miguel was yawning widely despite his protests that he wasn't tired. When the check came, Rafael and Carolina had a brief, whispered argument about splitting it that ended with them each paying half, though Rafael managed to sneak his credit card to the waiter to pay for the cake. Carolina was too tired to argue about it. Outside, the night air had cooled slightly, and the street was quieter now. Rafael had Miguel in his arms, the boy's head lolling against his father's shoulder, and Carolina held Julia's hand, her daughter leaning heavily against her side. "I should call a taxi," Carolina said reluctantly, not wanting the evening to end but knowing it had to. "Let me give you a ride," Rafael offered. "My car is just around the corner. It's not fancy, but it runs, and it's late for them to be out." Carolina wanted to refuse. She'd already accepted so much from him. But she was tired and Julia was heavy, and the thought of waiting for a taxi with a sleepy child was overwhelming. "Okay," she said. "Thank you." The car was indeed not fancy, an older model sedan that had clearly seen better days. But it was clean and it started on the first try. Carolina buckled Julia into the back seat, where she immediately curled up and continued sleeping. Miguel was in his car seat on the other side, already asleep with his mouth open. The drive to Carolina's apartment was quiet, the city sliding past outside the windows in a blur of lights and shadows. Rafael drove carefully, one hand on the wheel, and one resting on the center console between them. Carolina found herself watching his profile in the dim light, the way his jaw was still tight with tension, even though he'd smiled more tonight than he probably had in months. "Thank you," she said quietly, not wanting to wake the children. "For everything today, for seeing me, for the cake, for tonight. I don't know how to tell you what it meant." Rafael glanced at her, then back at the road. "You don't have to thank me. I think we both needed this. Miguel needed this. Sometimes the universe puts people together at exactly the right moment." "Do you believe that?" Carolina asked. "That things happen for a reason?" Rafael was quiet for a long moment. "I don't know," he said finally. "I want to. Mariana did. She believed that even terrible things had meaning, that suffering could teach us something. But I've been angry. So angry at a universe that would take a good woman away from her son. That would leave me alone to try to figure out how to be enough for him." He paused, his hand tightening on the steering wheel. "But tonight felt like maybe she was right. Maybe there is meaning. Maybe the meaning is that we're supposed to help each other. That none of us are supposed to do this alone." Carolina reached out then, acting on instinct, and placed her hand over his on the center console. His fingers were warm and slightly rough, and they turned to grip hers back, holding on like she was an anchor in a storm. They didn't talk anymore during the drive. They didn't need to. When Rafael pulled up in front of Carolina's building, a modest apartment complex in a working-class neighborhood, he put the car in park but didn't let go of her hand. "Can I—" He stopped, started again. "Can I see you again? Not a date. Not anything complicated, just friends. People who understand each other. Maybe the kids could play together sometime." Carolina's heart was pounding. Every rational part of her brain was screaming at her to be careful, to protect herself, to not let herself need anything from this man. But she thought about the cake, and the pizzeria, and Julia's happy face, and she thought about Rafael's tired eyes, and Miguel's insistence on sharing. She thought about Mariana's dying wish to spread love, even when hurting. "Yes," she said. "I'd like that." Rafael's smile was like dawn breaking. "Can I have your number?" They exchanged numbers, fingers fumbling with phones in the dark car, and then Carolina carefully extracted Julia from the back seat. Her daughter mumbled something incoherent, but didn't wake up, just wrapped her arms around Carolina's neck and burrowed close. "Good night," Carolina whispered to Rafael. "Thank you again." "Happy birthday, Carolina," Rafael said softly. "I'm glad we met you today." Carolina carried Julia upstairs to their small apartment, unlocking the door quietly and navigating through the dark living room to Julia's bedroom. She tucked her daughter into bed without changing her out of her good dress, too tired to fight with her if she woke up. Julia mumbled "my" and reached for her favorite stuffed rabbit, curling around it like she'd never let go. In her own room, Carolina sat on the edge of her bed and finally let herself process everything that had happened. This morning she'd woken up dreading this day, certain it would be just another reminder of everything she'd lost. And instead she'd met two people who'd turned her birthday into something beautiful, something real. Her phone buzzed. A text from an unknown number, except it wasn't unknown anymore. It was Raphael. "Made it home. Miguel is still asleep. Thank you for tonight, for letting us share your birthday. It was the first night since Mariana died that I've felt almost normal. Like maybe we're going to be okay." Carolina stared at the message, her eyes burning with tears again. She typed back slowly, "Thank you for seeing me when I felt invisible, for reminding me that good people still exist. Sleep well." His response came almost immediately. "You too. Talk tomorrow?" "Tomorrow," she confirmed. Carolina plugged in her phone and lay back on her bed, still fully clothed, staring at the ceiling. In the morning, everything would be complicated again. The bills wouldn't be paid. Her job would still be exhausting. Being a single mother would still be hard. But something had shifted. Some fundamental piece of her worldview had been rearranged. She wasn't alone. She didn't have to be alone. Maybe being strong didn't mean doing everything by herself. Maybe it meant knowing when to accept help, when to let people in, when to say yes to unexpected kindness. Across the city, Raphael was lying in his own bed, Miguel asleep in the room next door and thinking about the same thing, about how he'd promised Mariana he'd keep living, and how tonight, for the first time since she'd died, he'd actually felt alive. Not happy exactly, not yet, but alive, present, connected to something beyond his grief. He thought about Carolina's tears when they sang Happy Birthday, about the way she'd held her daughter with such fierce love, about the strength it took to keep going when everything hurt. He thought about how she'd accepted their cake, their company, their friendship, even though it would have been easier to say no. Even though saying yes meant being vulnerable. In the weeks that followed, they fell into an easy rhythm. Text messages throughout the day, small things, funny things the kids said, frustrations about work, random thoughts. They started meeting at the park on Sunday afternoons, letting Miguel and Julia play while they sat on a bench and talked. Sometimes they'd get ice cream or coffee, treating themselves to small luxuries they'd both been denying themselves for too long. Carolina learned that Raphael liked terrible action movies and strong coffee, and that he still slept on his side of the bed, even though Mariana wasn't there to take up the other side. Raphael learned that Carolina sang while she cooked, and that she'd wanted to travel to the beach but hadn't been since Julia was a baby because she couldn't afford it. They learned each other's wounds and each other's dreams, and slowly, carefully, they began to heal in each other's presence. It wasn't a romance, not at first. It was something more fundamental. Two people who'd been drowning finding someone else who understood what water in your lungs felt like. Two people who'd been invisible for so long finally being seen. They didn't fix each other. They didn't make everything better, but they made the hard things bearable. They made the lonely days less lonely. Julia and Miguel became inseparable, the way children do when they find their person. They had play dates and sleepovers, and they fought occasionally the way all friends do, but mostly they just existed in each other's space with an ease that made the adults jealous. Miguel taught Julia about building and engineering, spending hours with his blocks showing her how to make structures that wouldn't fall down. Julia taught Miguel about stories and imagination, reading to him from her favorite books with all the dramatic voices and gestures. One evening, about 3 months after that first meeting in the cafe, Raphael and Carolina were at his apartment while the kids played in Miguel's room. They'd just finished dinner, pasta with store-bought sauce, nothing fancy, and were washing dishes together in comfortable silence when Raphael spoke. "I need to tell you something," he said, his voice careful. "And I don't want you to feel any pressure, but I also don't want to not say it because I'm scared." Carolina put down the plate she was drying, her heart suddenly beating too fast. Okay. I'm falling in love with you, Raphael said simply, not looking at her, his hands still in the soapy water. Or maybe I'm already there. I don't know. I didn't mean to. I wasn't looking for it, but you've become essential to me, to Miguel. And I know it's complicated. I know you might not feel the same way. I know grief makes everything messy. But I needed you to know. Because Mariana taught me that life is too short not to tell people how you feel. Carolina stood frozen, the dish towel still in her hands. 1,000 thoughts raced through her mind, all the reasons this was too fast, too complicated, too risky. But underneath all of that was a simple truth. She loved him too. She loved his kindness and his wounded strength and the way he looked at his son. She loved how he saw her, really saw her, and didn't need her to pretend to be okay when she wasn't. I'm scared, she said finally. I'm so scared. My ex-husband destroyed me. I built walls so high because I never wanted to hurt like that again. And here you are, just walking through those walls like they don't exist, and it terrifies me. Raphael finally looked at her, his eyes wet. I'm scared too. I feel like loving you is betraying Mariana, even though I know she'd want this for me. She'd want me to be happy, but it still feels wrong sometimes, like I should be frozen in grief forever. So what do we do? Carolina whispered. We be honest, Raphael said. We take it slow. We don't hide from our kids what's happening. We don't make promises we can't keep, but we also don't run away from something good just because we're scared. We've both had enough pain. Maybe we're allowed to choose something good for once. Carolina set down the towel and walked over to him, taking his wet, soapy hands in hers. I love you too, she said, and saying it felt like jumping off a cliff and growing wings at the same time. I don't know how we make this work. I don't know what it looks like, but I want to try. Raphael pulled her close then, holding her tight against his chest, and she could feel his heart pounding as fast as hers. They stood like that for a long time, just holding each other, two broken people choosing to be brave together. From Miguel's room they heard laughter, their children playing, oblivious to the weight of the moment happening in the kitchen. That laughter, Carolina thought, was what it was all about. Creating space for joy even in the midst of hard things. Building something new even when you thought you were too damaged to build anything ever again. The next months weren't easy. Grief didn't just disappear because you fell in love. Bills didn't magically pay themselves because you had a partner. But they faced it together, and that made all the difference. When Carolina had a particularly bad shift at the hospital, Raphael would show up with takeout and patience. When Raphael had a night where missing Mariana felt like dying all over again, Carolina would sit with him in the dark and let him talk or cry or just be silent. They introduced each other to their families, a process that came with its own complications. Carolina's mother was skeptical, asking too many questions about Raphael's intentions and whether Carolina was sure she knew what she was doing. Raphael's sister, Sophia, was protective but ultimately kind, pulling Carolina aside one afternoon to say, I see the way he looks at you. I haven't seen him look at anything like that since Mariana. Thank you for giving him a reason to be present again. The children adjusted with surprising grace. When Raphael and Carolina sat them down to explain that they cared about each other and wanted to spend more time together as a family, Miguel just shrugged and said, I know. You hold hands now. Does this mean Julia can come over more? Julia had been more thoughtful, asking questions about what this meant for her papai, whether he'd come back now that her Mai had someone else. Carolina had held her and explained that no, her father wouldn't suddenly reappear, but that Raphael wasn't trying to replace him. He was just a good man who loved them and wanted to be part of their lives. A year after that first meeting in Sai,